Most people today think surviving extreme winter requires expensive gear. Thermal tents, battery-powered heaters, modern sleeping systems, waterproof synthetic clothing rated for sub-zero temperatures. And without those things, most modern people imagine death arriving quickly in a blizzard. But frontiersmen crossed frozen wilderness long before any of that existed. Trappers slept through storms that buried forests in snow. Hunters survived weeks in mountain cold with little more than wool, fire, fur, and experience. Pioneers endured winters that modern homes would struggle to handle even with electricity. And the strangest part is, many of them survived, not because they fought the cold harder, but because they understood it better. That's the forgotten survival wisdom modern people rarely think about anymore. Frontiersmen knew something important about winter. The cold itself was not always the real killer. Moisture was. Exhaustion was. Bad shelter decisions were. Panic was. Most people imagine frontier survival as dramatic struggle against snowstorms and frozen winds. But experienced woodsmen understood. Survival was usually decided before nightfall ever arrived. A man who entered darkness already wet, exhausted, and exposed often didn't survive until morning. A man who stayed dry, conserved strength, and built shelter early usually did. That difference was discipline, not equipment. And nowhere was that discipline more important than sleep. Because nighttime in frontier winters changed everything. Temperatures collapsed after sunset. Wind intensified. Sweat from the day froze inside clothing. And the human body became vulnerable the moment movement stopped producing heat. That's why experienced frontiersmen rarely waited until darkness to prepare camp. Modern people often delay shelter because the brain underestimates cold while moving. Walking creates warmth temporarily. Chopping wood creates warmth temporarily. But frontiersmen knew the dangerous cold arrived later, when work stopped and stillness began. So shelter came first. Always. Not fire, not food. Shelter. Because fire without shelter wastes heat into open wilderness. That's another forgotten piece of frontier wisdom. Modern people think bigger fires mean better survival. Frontiersmen often thought the opposite. A massive fire consumed enormous fuel, revealed position from miles away at night, and forced constant labor to maintain. Experienced woodsmen preferred controlled heat, trapped intelligently. A small fire in the right place mattered more than a giant fire in the wrong one. That's why many frontier camps were built around natural wind protection first. Thick pine cover, rock formations, hillsides, dense timber. Frontiersmen studied terrain constantly because terrain itself could preserve warmth before a single branch was cut. And one of the most important survival mistakes they avoided was sleeping directly on frozen ground. Modern people often underestimate how aggressively the earth steals heat from the body. Snow may look soft, but beneath it, frozen ground pulls warmth continuously through contact. A man wrapped in blankets directly on snow could still freeze slowly through the night because insulation underneath mattered just as much as insulation above. So frontiersmen built separation. Pine bough beds, dry grass layers, animal hides, raised bedding when possible, anything creating trapped air between body and earth. That trapped air became survival itself, because survival in frontier winters was really a battle of heat retention, not heat creation. And that changed how experienced men dressed too. Most modern people think heavy clothing alone kept frontiersmen alive, but heavy clothing could become deadly if managed poorly. Sweat was one of winter's greatest dangers. A frontiersman hiking hard through deep snow while overdressed often arrived at camp soaked beneath his layers, and once movement stopped, moisture froze quickly. Wet wool became heavy. Damp clothing robbed heat relentlessly. Exhaustion increased faster. That's why experienced woodsmen constantly adjusted layers while traveling, not to stay warm, to avoid overheating. That sounds backward to modern thinking, but frontier survival often depended on staying slightly cool while moving so the body stayed dry later. Because dry clothing at night mattered more than temporary comfort during the day. The same discipline applied to boots. Frozen feet destroyed men faster than almost anything else during long wilderness travel. Snow entered through seams, leather stiffened, socks stayed damp for days. Frostbite spread quietly because numbness disguised damage until tissue already began dying. So frontiersmen treated foot care almost like ritual. Dry socks near the fire, boots loosened carefully at camp, feet checked constantly for whitening or numbness. Some trappers even slept with certain clothing items inside blankets or under bedding so body heat prevented freezing overnight. Because once boots froze solid by morning, travel became dangerous immediately. And survival depended on movement as much as shelter. That's another thing modern people misunderstand about frontier winter survival. Stopping completely often became more dangerous than continuing carefully. Isolation changed everything in the 1800s. No rescue helicopters, no emergency beacons, no heated vehicles waiting nearby. A frontiersman trapped alone in mountain weather often survived only through routine discipline repeated every single day. Gather wood before dark, protect dry tinder, maintain socks, prepare bedding, control sweat, eat before sleep, check wind direction. Small habits decided survival because winter punished neglected details brutally. And one forgotten technique especially separated experienced frontiersmen from inexperienced travelers: heat reflection. Many camps were built around reflective fire setups rather than open flames alone. A fire placed beside rock walls, fallen logs, or simple lean-to structures pushed heat back towards sleeping areas instead of losing everything into darkness. Some trappers even built long reflector fires specifically designed to radiate warmth evenly across bedding through the night. And bedding itself became survival engineering. Blankets alone rarely solved the problem. Frontiersmen layered materials intelligently. Fur closest to the body sometimes, wool outer layers, pine bough insulation underneath, oilcloth barriers blocking moisture or wind. Every layer had purpose. Every mistake carried consequence. Because in true frontier winters, the difference between discomfort and death was often surprisingly small. A wet blanket, a poor campsite, insufficient wood gathered before stormfall. One careless decision in daylight could become fatal after midnight. And experienced frontiersmen understood something modern people rarely experience anymore. Winter does not usually kill dramatically. It kills quietly. Through fatigue, poor judgment, slow heat loss, the kind that begins with discomfort and ends with sleep becoming impossible to resist. That's why experienced woodsmen feared exhaustion almost as much as the cold itself. Because exhausted men stopped maintaining discipline, stopped gathering enough wood, stopped drying clothing properly, stopped thinking clearly. And winter punished mental mistakes faster than physical weakness. That's why the strongest frontiersmen were rarely the loudest or most aggressive men. Usually, they were the calmest, the most patient, the men who respected winter instead of challenging it. Because frontier survival was never really about conquering nature. It was about understanding exactly how little mistakes became deadly once the snow started falling. One of the biggest survival secrets frontiersmen understood was that warmth did not come from fire alone. It came from trapped heat. That's why experienced woodsmen spent far more energy building proper shelter than building massive fires. A poorly placed fire burned through wood quickly and lost most of its heat into open air. But a small protected shelter could hold warmth through the night using surprisingly little fuel. Lean-tos were common because they reflected fire heat back toward the body while blocking wind at the same time. Thick pine branches were layered heavily across roofs and walls to trap insulation naturally. Snow itself was sometimes packed around shelter edges because packed snow blocked wind better than open gaps. Modern people often think snow automatically makes survival harder. Frontiersmen sometimes used it as insulation. That's old-world survival knowledge most people forgot. Inside these shelters, sleeping position mattered too. Men slept close to the fire, but not too close. Too much heat caused sweating, and sweat became dangerous once flames burned lower during the night. Blankets and fur were wrapped tightly around feet and chest because heat loss from extremities increased exhaustion quickly. And before sleep, many frontiersmen ate heavily whenever food allowed, not for comfort, for heat. Digesting food helped the body generate warmth through the coldest hours of darkness. Fat became especially valuable during winter travel because fat burned slowly and produced long-lasting energy. Hunters and trappers understood this long before modern survival science explained it. But even more important than food was routine. Frontier winter survival depended on repeated discipline. Gather more wood than you think you need. Dry clothing before sleeping. Protect tinder from moisture. Never trust calm weather too long. Experienced men followed these routines constantly because blizzards turned small mistakes into deadly problems very quickly. And storms changed human psychology too. Long winter isolation exhausted people mentally. Endless wind. Darkness arriving early. Frozen silence across forests. A frontiersman alone in deep winter had to control fear carefully because panic caused rushed decisions, and rushed decisions in freezing conditions often ended badly. That's why experienced woodsmen moved slower during storms instead of faster. They conserved strength, protected body heat, stayed aware of surroundings. Because exhaustion made men careless, and winter punished carelessness immediately, the strongest frontiersmen were usually not the men trying to overpower nature. They were the men patient enough to work with it. Men who understood wind direction, understood snow conditions, understood when to travel and when to stop moving entirely. And most importantly, they understood that survival in frontier winters was rarely about toughness alone. It was about discipline repeated every single day. Small habits, careful preparation, controlled movement. Because in the old frontier wilderness, survival was often decided long before the blizzard ever arrived. And maybe the most important thing frontiersmen understood about winter survival had nothing to do with gear at all. It was psychological, because after enough days inside deep wilderness snow, the cold stopped feeling like weather. It started feeling like pressure. Pressure on the body. Pressure on judgment. Pressure on discipline. Modern people rarely experience true winter isolation anymore. But frontiersmen lived inside weather directly. Storms did not interrupt life. Storms became life. And that changed the human mind completely. A man crossing frozen wilderness in the 1800s often spent days hearing nothing except wind, boots crushing snow, trees creaking in cold air, and the distant cracking sounds of ice deep inside forests. No engines, no electric lights, no city noise, just cold and silence. That silence affected people psychologically, especially at night. Darkness arrived early, temperatures collapsed fast, and once firelight became the only visible warmth for miles, men understood how small they really were against winter wilderness. That's why experienced frontiersmen respected routine so heavily. Routine protected the mind as much as the body. Gather wood before sunset, dry clothing before sleeping, Protect tinder from moisture. Check boots carefully. Never waste daylight. Small, repeated habits created stability inside dangerous conditions. And one of the greatest dangers during winter survival was false confidence. A man survives one blizzard and begins rushing camp setup the next evening, stops gathering enough firewood, stops checking clothing properly, stops respecting weather. That's usually when winter punished him, because frontier cold rarely killed immediately. It drained people slowly. Exhaustion first, then poor decisions, then dangerous sleepiness. That's why experienced woodsmen feared fatigue constantly. Heavy snow travel burned enormous energy. Wet gear increased exhaustion. Cold weakened judgment. So frontiersmen learned to conserve movement whenever possible. Even simple tasks were done carefully. Wood gathered efficiently, shelter chosen early, travel routes planned intelligently. Because wasted energy became danger after sunset. Food itself also became psychological protection. Warm meals raised morale during brutal weather. Coffee around a fire created routine and emotional stability. Salted meat, stews, animal fat, whatever could survive winter travel became more than calories. It became comfort. Something predictable inside unpredictable wilderness. That's another forgotten part of frontier survival modern people underestimate. Morale mattered. A hopeless man made careless decisions faster. An exhausted man without routine lost discipline faster. And winter punished mental weakness almost as aggressively as physical weakness. That's why experienced frontiersmen rarely panicked openly during storms. Calmness spread through camp the same way fear did. One frightened traveler could make an entire group rush decisions and waste energy. But calm men stabilized others. They kept fires maintained, kept shelter organized, kept routines moving, and organization itself became survival. Wet gear left carelessly froze overnight. Snow buried tools. Firewood disappeared faster than expected. Small, neglected details became dangerous problems quickly. That's why experienced trappers prepared camp almost the same way every night, no matter how tired they were. Shelter first, fire second, drying gear third, food after. Because discipline prevented exhaustion from controlling decisions. And perhaps the most dangerous moment in winter survival was the temptation to stop trying. Extreme cold slowly pushes the body toward stillness. Men lost in storms sometimes sat down beside trees just to rest. Many never stood up again. That's why experienced woodsmen forced themselves to keep moving before the body cooled completely. Forced routines, even when exhausted. Because once body heat disappeared, recovery became difficult. Modern survival often focuses heavily on gear lists, but frontier survival focused more on habits, patience, observation, discipline, respect for weather, respect for exhaustion, respect for small mistakes. That was the real frontier survival system. And maybe that's why these old-world techniques still matter today. Not because modern people will live exactly like frontiersmen again, but because frontier wisdom reminds people of something civilization made easy to forget. Human survival never depended entirely on comfort. It depended on understanding reality clearly. And the men who crossed frozen wilderness successfully were usually not the men trying to conquer winter. They were the men disciplined enough to adapt to it. And before we end this documentary, if you're someone interested in building a faceless YouTube channel like this one and earning from videos like these, there is a way some creators speed up the monetization process. Instead of waiting months to reach 4,000 watch hours and 1,000 subscribers, they use a service that helps them reach those requirements much faster. If you want to learn more about it, you can check the link in the description. If this video changed the way you think about winter survival, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with the forgotten frontier survival habit you think modern people would struggle with most today. Because long before modern gear existed, men still survived winters harsh enough to kill the unprepared. And they did it with discipline, experience, and knowledge most people have already forgotten. Thanks for watching.